The clock had just struck 2 a.m. when the pounding on my front door shook me awake. Not a polite knock, this was frantic, desperate, the kind that carries fear in every slam. I grabbed the nearest lamp, heart hammering, and rushed to the hallway. When I opened the door, my daughter collapsed into my arms, her face swollen, her lips split, her body trembling like a hunted bird. "Mom," she whispered through blood and tears, "he hit me because of her." In that instant, the world I had fought to keep safe for her shattered. I wasn't just a retired officer anymore. I was a mother on fire, holding my broken child, already knowing this night would change everything. Before we begin, I invite you to subscribe so you won't miss the good story that might brighten your day. It was 2 in the morning when the pounding began, sharp, frantic, relentless. The kind of knock that doesn't just ask for the door to be opened, but demands it, claws at it, begs for it. I shot upright in my chair, my neck stiff from having fallen asleep with the TV humming in the background. The old crime drama flickered across the screen, painting my living room in cold blue light. For one dizzying moment, I thought it was part of the show. But then it came again, 3 fast thuds, urgent, desperate. My heart lurched. After 30 years as a police officer, I had trained myself not to panic, but retirement had softened the sharp edges of my instincts. Still, I knew enough to recognize danger in the sound of that knock. I moved toward the door, my bare feet dragging against the cool wooden floor. The clock on the wall glowed 2:07 a.m. in pale green digits. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steadier than my pulse. At first, silence, then a trembling voice, ragged and small. "Mom, please, open up." I froze, that voice hoarse, broken, but unmistakable. "Elena, my daughter." I tore the lock open, and the moment the door cracked, her body collapsed against mine. She crumpled like a rag doll in my arms. I caught her, my breath stolen as the porch light illuminated her face. Her lip was split, swollen and crusted with dried blood. Her left eye was purple, nearly swollen shut. Finger-shaped bruises climbed up her arms like cruel tattoos. Her blouse was torn at the shoulder, and she clutched her stomach as if holding herself together. Dear God, Elena. My knees nearly buckled, but I tightened my grip and pulled her inside. She tried to speak but broke into sobs. Between gasps, the words came out. "Victor, he hit me. He said I was worthless because of her." I didn't need to ask who her was. I had long suspected, but hearing it confirmed felt like glass shattering inside my chest. For a moment, I wanted to scream, to storm into the night, to put my service pistol, locked away since retirement, back in my hand, but I swallowed it all. My rage could wait. My daughter could not. I guided Elena to the sofa, easing her down gently. She winced, clutching her ribs. "SHHH, I've got you," I whispered, my voice steadier than the storm inside me. In the kitchen, I boiled water with shaking hands. I peeled slices of ginger, dropped them into the pot, added honey the way she loved when she was a child fighting winter colds. The familiar act steadied me. It reminded me that beneath all the chaos, I was still her mother. When I returned, she was trembling under the dim lamplight. I pressed the warm cup into her hands. She tried to hold it, but her fingers shook so badly I had to steady it for her. The scent of ginger filled the room, soft and sharp at once. I fetched a cloth, dipped it into warm water, and carefully dabbed the blood from her lip. She winced but didn't resist. Her eyes glistened with shame as if she believed the wounds were her fault. "I couldn't take it anymore," she whispered, staring at the carpet. I had to run. Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them away. I stroked her hair like I had when she was 5 and afraid of thunderstorms. "You did the right thing, you came home." She laid her head on my shoulder, her sobs finally slowing into hiccups. Within minutes, exhaustion overtook her. My little girl, 32 years old now, but still my little girl, slumped against me, asleep but restless, her body twitching with nightmares she couldn't escape. I lowered her onto the sofa, covered her with the old quilt her grandmother had made, and stood there for a long moment. I watched her chest rise and fall, fragile but alive, and I made a silent vow she would never face this alone again. That was when my eyes drifted toward the old oak cabinet in the corner of the living room. For years, it had been nothing more than storage, faded photo albums, tax files, little mementos from a life I thought I had left behind. But behind it all, wrapped in a brown folder tied with string, were the tools of a life I once knew too well. I opened the cabinet. My hands brushed against a worn leather folder, a digital recorder, and a heavy black camera. Artifacts from my years in uniform. The moment I touched them, it felt as though my spine straightened, my breath deepened. The police officer I had once been stirred awake. Most people looked at me now and saw only age, gray hair, tired hands, the quiet patience of a retired widow. But I still had something left in me. Something Victor would regret underestimating. I closed the cabinet with a quiet thud. The path ahead was clear, no shouting matches, no reckless rage. The battle would be fought with patience, evidence, and truth. I sat back down beside Alina, brushing a strand of hair from her bruised face. I whispered so softly that only I could hear, "You're safe, and I promise I will not let this go." Then I picked up the phone. Before dialing, I paused and looked straight into the lens of the camera on my old laptop, the one I used to record case notes years ago. I imagined the audience on the other side, strangers but allies in spirit. Before we continue, I said quietly, if you believe no woman should suffer in silence, subscribe so you never miss a story of courage. Then I dialed the number I hadn't used in years. After 3 rings, a groggy male voice answered. "James Ellison," he mumbled, clearly pulled from sleep. "It's Louise Montoya," I said, my voice steady, almost cold. "Prepare the file, tonight we start." The line went silent for a long second, then James breathed sharply. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," I replied. He put his hands on my daughter. "Now I'm putting the law on him." I hung up, the weight of the decision settling over me like armor. I glanced back at Alina, sleeping fitfully on the sofa. The lamp flickered across her bruises, shadows stretching across the wall like scars etched into the room itself. And I knew, as the clock struck 2:30 a.m., that my quiet life had ended the moment she knocked on my door. The hospital was half asleep when we arrived, its fluorescent lights humming against the silence of the night. The corridors smelled faintly of antiseptic and bitter coffee, the kind that nurses drank just to stay upright through the graveyard shift. I held Alina's arm as we walked in. Though walked was generous, she leaned heavily against me, each step punctuated by a wince, her breath sharp and shallow. At the reception desk, a young nurse blinked up at us, startled by Alina's condition. "Emergency intake," I said firmly, sliding my retired police badge across the counter. The nurse's eyes widened, and she immediately nodded, pushing a clipboard toward me. Within minutes, Dr. Maria Cortez appeared, a woman I had once partnered with on domestic violence cases back in my active duty years. Her eyes softened with recognition, then darkened when she saw Alina's face. "Louise," she said quietly, "I'll take care of her. But you know the drill, photographs, reports, everything documented." I nodded, the weight of her words pressing down. This wasn't just about healing my daughter, it was about building a case brick by brick. While Dr. Cortez examined Alina, I slipped out into the hallway, my mind already calculating. I took out my phone and opened the security app I had convinced my neighbor, Mr. Alvarez, to set up months ago. His camera pointed directly toward the street where Alina had run from Victor's house. My fingers moved quickly, downloading the footage from the cloud. There she was, my daughter at 1:14 a.m., pounding at my door, her silhouette trembling under the streetlight. The sight made my stomach twist, but I forced myself to keep watching. The timestamp burned into the corner of the video, cold, undeniable proof. I copied the file onto a flash drive and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Evidence preserved. Back inside, Alina sat on the exam table, her shoulders trembling as Dr. Cortez gently pressed along her ribs. She flinched at the touch. I saw the doctor's face tighten, though she said nothing except, "We'll need X-rays." She handed me a chart and whispered, "Several contusions, possibly cracked rib. She's lucky to be alive." Lucky. That word rang like a curse in my ears. I signed the intake forms, the pen heavy in my hand. Just as I scrawled my name, my phone buzzed. A blocked number. I opened the message. "Shut her up or she disappears." The words glared at me cold and jagged across the tiny screen. My throat tightened, but I refused to let fear seep into my face. Instead, I tapped save, screenshotting it twice. I filed it silently in my growing arsenal. When I looked up, Elena was watching me, tears streaking down her face. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling, "don't fight him, you don't understand. Victor owns this town, the police, the lawyers, even the judge. He'll crush us." I walked toward her, set the phone down, and took her hands in mine. Her knuckles were scraped raw, the skin cold. She looked like a child again, terrified, pleading for me to step back. I leaned close, pressing my forehead to hers, and whispered, "Then we fight with the truth." For the first time that night, her eyes flickered with something other than fear. Hope, faint and fragile, but hope nonetheless. Hours later, when the X-rays were done and Elena had been given pain medication, we returned home under the gray light of early dawn. She fell asleep almost immediately, her body too exhausted to resist. I tucked the quilt around her, brushed a kiss against her temple, and stood for a long time watching her breathe. But my mind wasn't at rest. Not yet. I walked into my study, flipped on the desk lamp, and pulled out a thick, battered folder from the drawer. Inside were photographs from the hospital, copies of medical reports Dr. Cortez had emailed, the flash drive with Alvarez's footage, and the threatening text I had just received. Each page, each file, was a brick in the wall I was building against Victor. I laid them out on the table in neat rows. My hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of what I was about to do. This wasn't just about my daughter anymore. It was about justice. At sunrise, I called James Ellison, the lawyer who had once stood by me during the hardest years of my career. His voice crackled over the line, tired but alert. "Louise," he asked, as if he already knew trouble had come. "I'm bringing the file," I told him. "Every photo, every report, every shred of proof, but James," I hesitated, the words heavy on my tongue. "He forged the land papers too, didn't he?" There was silence on the other end, the kind of silence that confirms your worst fears. The next morning, the sun broke through the blinds in weak golden streaks, but the light brought no comfort. Elena was still asleep on the sofa, her face pale against the quilt, her breathing shallow. I let her rest, kissed her forehead gently, and slipped out, the weight of the folder under my arm. At James Ellison's office, the air smelled of old books and strong coffee. James was already seated at his desk, reading over the files I had given him hours earlier. His brows furrowed deeper with each page. Finally, he exhaled sharply, tapping the corner of one document. "Louise," he said, his voice grim, "you were right. Victor forged Elena's signature. He filed a deed transfer last week. According to this, the ancestral house, the one your father built with his own hands, no longer belongs to you. On paper, it's his." The words struck like a hammer. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. That house wasn't just walls and bricks. It was where Elena had taken her first steps, where my late husband had carved our initials into the oak doorframe, where decades of sacrifice had rooted our family history. And now, with a forged signature, Victor had stolen it all. I sank into the chair across from James, my fingers trembling as I traced the fake signature. It was jagged, uneven, almost insulting in its carelessness. I had spent years teaching Elena how to write her name in perfect loops as a child. This wasn't her hand. It was a lie dressed as truth. For a fleeting second, memory carried me back, 30 years ago when I was younger, a widow struggling to raise a child alone. I worked double shifts, skipped meals to afford her textbooks, pawned my wedding ring to pay for her college applications. Every sacrifice I had made was tied to that house, that legacy. And now Victor dared to strip it away with a stroke of a pen. I clenched my fists until my knuckles ached. Rage boiled inside me, but I forced myself to stay calm. The law would be my weapon, not fury. "James," I whispered, my voice low but steady, "we won't let him win. Not this time." He nodded, though the lines of worry around his mouth deepened. By noon, the gossip had already spread through town like wildfire. I could feel it before I heard it. At the marketplace, whispers clung to the air as thick as the smell of frying tortillas. "She's using her badge to frame her son-in-law," one woman muttered to another as I passed by. "Poor Victor," a man added, shaking his head. First his wife invents stories of abuse, now the mother-in-law wants his money. Their words sliced deeper than any blade. These were neighbors who had shared bread at my table, who had watched Alina grow up, who had once praised my service as an officer. Now they looked at me with suspicion, as though I were the villain in my own story. I held my head high, even as shame pressed against my chest. Years of discipline taught me never to show weakness in front of an enemy, even when the enemy wore the face of people you once trusted. At one stall, Mrs. Rivera, an old friend from church, pulled me aside. Her voice trembled. "Louise, I don't know what to believe. People are saying terrible things, that Alina bruised herself, that you forged the papers to steal from him." I swallowed hard, forcing a tight smile. "Do you believe that?" I asked quietly. Her eyes flickered, torn between doubt and loyalty. She didn't answer. Instead, she touched my arm and whispered, "Be careful. This town chooses sides quickly, and it's rarely the right side." When I returned home, the mailbox clanged as I opened it. Inside lay a single envelope, unmarked, the handwriting jagged and hurried. My pulse quickened as I tore it open. "Stop now, or she pays the price." My breath caught in my throat, the paper shook in my hands. For a moment, fear stabbed through me, the thought of Alina harmed again, of her fragile body broken beyond repair. But fear gave way to fire. I walked inside, placed the note carefully into the evidence folder, and locked it away. Another brick for the wall I was building. This wasn't just about one abusive man anymore. Victor wasn't only violent, he was a manipulator, a master puppeteer who twisted the minds of the community and poisoned them with lies. He had power, influence, and a network of cowards who preferred silence to truth. But he didn't have me. I stood at the window, watching as dusk painted the town in shades of gray. My reflection in the glass startled me. I didn't see a weary retiree anymore. I saw steel in my eyes, lines of battle carved into my face. I saw a woman who had spent her life surviving storms and was ready to start one of her own. Behind me, Alina stirred from the sofa, her voice weak. "Mom, why are they saying those things? Why do they believe him?" I turned and knelt beside her, cupping her hand in mine. "Because lies are easier to swallow than ugly truths," I said softly. "But the truth has teeth, Alina. It will bite back." She cried quietly, pressing her face into my shoulder. "I don't know if I can face it." I kissed her hair, whispering, "You don't have to face it alone." That evening, I met James again, laying the thick folder on his desk. The evidence was growing: medical records, photographs, threatening notes, forged documents. Each piece was a nail in Victor's coffin. James sifted through the papers, his jaw tight. Finally, he looked up, his eyes sharp with calculation. "There's someone who knows the truth," he said. "Victor's mistress, Isabel." The name lingered in the air like smoke. "If you can convince her to testify," James continued, "we'll have more than bruises and forged papers. We'll have a witness who saw it all. If she speaks, Louise, we win." I leaned back in my chair, my heart pounding. Convincing Isabel meant stepping into the lion's den, into the world Victor controlled. It was dangerous, reckless even. But I knew in that moment, it was the path I had to take. The following evening, I left Alina under the watchful eye of my neighbor Mrs. Rivera, who had finally admitted she no longer trusted the rumors spreading around town. "I'll sit with her," she promised, touching my arm. "You go do what you need to do." Her words gave me courage. I slipped into jeans, a plain jacket, and a cap pulled low to hide my face. Retired cop or not, I knew better than to walk into enemy territory wearing the wrong expression. The bar sat on the edge of town, where the highway curved past a cluster of dimly lit motels. Its neon sign buzzed faintly, the red letters flickering against the night sky, El Paraíso, but the place was no paradise. Smoke clung to the air inside, curling from ashtrays crowded with half-burned cigarettes. The jukebox sputtered out old ranchera songs, loud enough to cover whispered deals but not loud enough to drown out trouble. I slid into a booth in the corner, my back to the wall, eyes on the door. It didn't take long. Isabel entered with the kind of confidence that looks rehearsed. She wore a crimson dress, heels clicking against the cracked tile floor, her lips painted the same shade as her drink. She smiled at the bartender like a queen addressing her subject, but when she caught sight of me, her expression faltered. She approached slowly, her eyes narrowing. "So," she said, sliding into the booth across from me, "the famous mother-in-law finally shows her face. What do you want, Louise? A confession? A fight?" Her voice dripped with mockery, but I saw the tightness in her jaw, the way her fingers trembled slightly as they wrapped around her cocktail glass. I didn't waste words. Instead, I placed a manila envelope on the table and pushed it toward her. "Take a look." With a smirk, she opened it, then froze. Inside was a photocopy of the forged property transfer with Victor's handwriting scrawled across the margins, alongside her own bank statements, all bleeding red with overdue notices. The color drained from her face. She tried to laugh, but the sound cracked. "Where did you get these?" she whispered. "Does it matter?" I asked, my tone even. "Victor promised you the world, didn't he? A slice of land, a life without worry. But he forged my daughter's name and used you as cover. You're drowning in debt while he's buying suits and paying off judges." Her eyes darted toward the bar mirror, as though expecting Victor to materialize behind her. "He told me he said everything was under control." I leaned in closer. "Victor will leave you behind the moment you're no longer useful. But if you tell the truth, if you testify, you can save yourself." Her hand shook as she raised her glass, draining it in one gulp. When she set it down, her lipstick left a faint red stain against the rim. She didn't speak right away, and I could hear the tremor in her breathing. Just then, the bar door slammed open. Two of Victor's men stepped inside, shoulders broad, eyes scanning the room. I recognized them instantly, his enforcers, the same ones who had followed me in the alley last week. They spotted us and started forward, menace in every step. I didn't flinch. Calmly, I reached into my jacket, pulled out my worn leather badge case, and flipped it open on the table. The golden shield gleamed beneath the dim light. "You boys want to try something?" I said, my voice low but steady. "Go ahead." The bigger one sneered, but his eyes flickered with hesitation. They exchanged a glance, then back toward the door. "This isn't over," one muttered before slipping out into the night. The jukebox continued playing as though nothing had happened, but Isabel's face had gone pale as chalk. She clutched the edge of the table like it was the only solid thing in her world. "You see," I said softly, "Victor can't protect you. He can't even protect himself. All he'll do is drag you down with him." Her eyes filled with something I hadn't expected, fear, yes, but also a flicker of desperation, the kind of look you see in someone teetering on the edge of survival. She bit her lip hard enough to smear the red. Finally, she whispered, "If I testify, will you promise me safety?" "I'll do everything in my power," I told her, and I meant it. She nodded once, then again, more firmly this time. "Fine, I'll testify. But if he finds out before then," she didn't finish. I slid out of the booth, placing a hand on her shoulder. "He won't, I'll make sure of it." Outside, the night air felt heavier, as if the town itself was holding its breath. I stepped into the shadows and dialed an old number. "Rosales," came the familiar gravelly voice of my former commander. "It's Louise," I said quickly. "I have a witness who needs protection, quietly, no leaks." He didn't hesitate. "Where do you want her?" "A safe apartment out on the outskirts," I replied. "Somewhere Victor's dogs won't sniff out." "Consider it done." Relief coursed through me, but it was fleeting. I knew the real battle hadn't even begun. By dawn, the sky was painted in pale pink streaks. Alina walked beside me as we climbed the courthouse steps. She was dressed in a simple blue dress, a scarf draped carefully to hide the last of her bruises. Her hand trembled in mine, but she didn't let go. At the top of the stairs, he was waiting. Victor stood tall in an immaculate suit, his hair slicked back, his smirk sharp enough to cut. Beside him, a lawyer I recognized immediately, Hector Valdivia, a shark from Mexico City, known for tearing witnesses apart in courtrooms. Victor's gaze locked onto mine, cold and unyielding, as though daring me to blink first. I didn't. The courthouse smelled of dust and polished oak, the air heavy with anticipation. Every seat was filled. Curious neighbors pressed into the back rows, their whispers fluttering like moths in the dim light. Some had come to see justice, others had come for spectacle, but all eyes shifted when Alina and I entered. I held her hand tightly as we walked down the aisle to our table. She wore her blue dress again, scarf carefully hiding what was left of the bruises. I could feel her hand trembling inside mine, and I squeezed it, whispering, "We stand together, remember that." James Ellison, our lawyer, adjusted his tie and leaned toward us. "Stay calm," he murmured. "Let the evidence speak, that's our weapon." Across the room, Victor sat smug in a tailored suit, his arm draped lazily across the back of his chair. At his side was Hector Valdivia, a man whose reputation preceded him, a courtroom predator, slick and merciless. He caught my eye and smirked as if daring me to flinch. The judge entered and the gavel cracked against wood. This court is now in session. Valdivia wasted no time. He rose, his voice smooth, his confidence thick. "Ladies and gentlemen, my client Victor Mendoza is a victim of lies. Alina fabricated stories of abuse to manipulate her husband and extort money. And Luis Montoya, once a respected officer, abused her former position to intimidate and collect false evidence. This is not about truth, this is about greed." Gasps echoed through the room. A woman in the back whispered, "Maybe it's true," and my heart tightened. Alina lowered her head, shame washing across her face. I wanted to rise, to shout them all down, but James touched my arm. "Wait," he whispered. "Our turn is coming." And then it did. James stood, his voice steady but fierce. "We don't ask you to take our word, we present facts." He clicked a remote, and the first image appeared on the courtroom screen. Alina's swollen lip, her eye blackened, her ribs bandaged. Murmurs rippled through the room. Next came the medical report. Dr. Cortez took the stand, explaining in clinical detail the extent of Alina's injuries. "These were not accidents," she said firmly. "They were repeated blows, consistent with assault." The screen shifted again. The grainy video from Mr. Alvarez's camera filled the room. At 1:14 a.m., Alina could be seen pounding on my door, her cries muffled but undeniable. The sound of her voice, desperate and broken, pierced the silence of the courtroom. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably, others stared at Victor with narrowed eyes. James wasn't finished. He placed the forged property transfer on the table. "This document," he said, holding it up, was filed under Alina's name. But the handwriting is inconsistent, the signature a fraud. Victor Mendoza attempted to steal his wife's inheritance through forgery. Finally, James displayed the text message I had received. "Shut her up or she disappears." The words glared across the screen, chilling in their simplicity. The crowd stirred. Even some of Victor's friends looked away. Valdivia stood, objecting, twisting each point with lawyerly venom. "Bruises can be self-inflicted. Video footage can be dramatized. Forgery, a misunderstanding." His words were sharp, but for the first time they rang hollow. Then James dropped the final piece of the puzzle. "The court will now hear from Isabel Ramirez." The room fell silent. Isabel walked slowly to the stand, her crimson dress muted now under the courtroom lights. Her confidence from the bar was gone. She looked fragile, her hands trembling as she was sworn in. Valdivia leaned forward, smirking. "The mistress, really?" he scoffed, but James ignored him. Tell the court what you know, James said gently. Isabel swallowed hard, then spoke, her voice wavering. Victor promised me a share of the land. He told me to sign documents, to pretend it was all legal. He said Alina didn't deserve it, that she was weak. But I saw, her voice cracked. She steadied herself. I saw him hit her, more than once. He laughed about it afterward. He said no one would believe her. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Someone gasped. A man muttered, "My God." Victor shot up from his chair, his face red with fury. "You liar," he shouted. "You betrayed me." He lunged forward, but the bailiffs grabbed his arms, forcing him back into his seat as he fought like a wild animal. The judge slammed the gavel. "Order in the court, one more outburst and you'll be removed." For the first time, I saw fear flicker in the crowd, fear not of me but of him. The mask was slipping. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand, my knees steady despite the weight of decades on them. I raised my hand, swore the oath, and faced the court. I spent 30 years as an officer, I began, my voice calm, resonant. But today I speak not as a cop, I speak as a mother. I turned to face the jury, then the crowd. Abuse is not discipline, fraud is not business, and silence, I paused, letting the words settle. Silence is not peace. The room hushed. Even Valdivia leaned back, his smirk gone. I glanced at Alina, her eyes glistening with tears, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw her shoulders straighten. She believed again in me, in us, in the truth. The trial stretched into the afternoon. Arguments flew, objections were raised, tempers flared, but the evidence stood unyielding. By the time the judge returned to deliver his verdict, the sun had already begun to dip, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor. Everyone rose. Judge Cervantes cleared his throat, his voice solemn. This court issues an immediate protective order for Alina Montoya. All assets belonging to Victor Mendoza are frozen pending investigation. The forged property transfer is null and void, and the district attorney is instructed to pursue charges of domestic violence, forgery, and witness intimidation. Gasps filled the room. Alina covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. I reached for her hand, gripping it tightly. Victor slumped in his chair, pale, sweat dripping down his forehead. For the first time, he looked small, powerless. But as the gavel struck and the crowd erupted into murmurs, a cold weight pressed against my chest. I knew this wasn't the end. Men like Victor didn't surrender quietly. The morning after the verdict, the front page of the local paper carried a headline that would echo through town for weeks. Businessman arrested for fraud and domestic violence. Beneath it, a grainy photo of Victor, his wrists in cuffs, head lowered, his once pristine suit now wrinkled under the harsh grip of two officers. For years, people had whispered about his power, his influence, his untouchable reputation. But now the mask was gone, and the whole town could see the truth. By noon, his two henchmen were in custody as well. The same men who once prowled alleys with cigarettes dangling from their lips now stood behind bars, charged with intimidation and obstruction. The streets felt different, lighter somehow, as though a shadow had lifted. Isabel vanished not long after. Rumor had it she took a bus north, chasing work in another city, trying to leave the wreckage behind. Some neighbors muttered that she deserved worse for her role in everything. But when I thought of her, I felt only a quiet ache. She had been another piece in Victor's cruel game. I hope she finds her way out, I whispered one evening to James as we left the courthouse. He nodded, his expression softening. Sometimes surviving is the bravest testimony. At home, Alina began the slow climb out of the darkness. Therapy sessions became part of her week, and though the first ones left her drained, they slowly stitched her together again. Dr. Cortez had warned me, healing isn't linear, Louise. There will be setbacks, nightmares, but she has your strength in her. And she did. One late afternoon, I walked into the kitchen to find Alina humming softly while stirring a pot of beans. The sound stopped me in my tracks. It was a simple tune, barely audible, but it was the first time I'd heard her sing in years. My throat tightened and tears welled in my eyes before I could stop them. She looked up, surprised. "Mom, what's wrong?" "Nothing," I whispered, pressing a hand to my heart. "Absolutely nothing, keep singing." She smiled, a real smile, not the brittle mask she'd worn for so long. In that moment, I knew we were turning a corner. The town, too, began to shift. At the market one morning, Mrs. Rivera approached me with a bag of apples in her hand. Her voice trembled as she said, "Louise, I'm sorry. I listened to the lies. I doubted you. I doubted her." I studied her for a moment, then placed the apples back in her basket. "Learn to believe the bruises, not the rumors," I said gently. Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. Others followed. A shopkeeper slipped me a loaf of bread with no charge. An old man tipped his hat as I passed, mumbling, "You did right, Montoya, we see it now." I accepted each apology without bitterness. Anger had burned hot in me for too long. Forgiveness felt like laying down a heavy stone I had carried for miles. Evenings became my sanctuary. I would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sky bleed into shades of gold and crimson. The cicadas sang in the trees, and the breeze carried the faint scent of jasmine from the neighbor's yard. From inside, I could hear Elena moving about the house, her footsteps lighter, her laughter returning bit by bit. One sunset, as the horizon glowed like fire, I found myself speaking aloud, though no one else sat beside me. "Justice doesn't erase scars," I murmured, my eyes on the fading light. "But it gives us breath, dignity, and tomorrow. Respect must be given first, not begged for later." The words hung in the air, carried off by the wind, maybe to someone who needed them. That night, Elena joined me on the porch, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She placed one in my hand and said quietly, "You saved me, Mom." I shook my head. "No, sweetheart, you saved yourself the moment you knocked on my door," I just answered. She leaned against me, resting her head on my shoulder, and together we watched the stars appear one by one. Looking back now, I realize justice is not just something handed down in a courtroom. It's something we fight for in the quiet moments, when it would be easier to stay silent. I've learned that silence only feeds the darkness, but truth, no matter how heavy, always lets the light in. As someone who has walked through betrayal, fear, and loneliness, I want to pass this lesson to you. Respect must be given freely at the beginning of any relationship, not begged for when the damage is already done. If we fail to recognize that, we teach people how to mistreat us. But I also ask you, what would you do if you were in my place? Would you choose to stay quiet for the sake of keeping the peace, or would you risk everything to defend your dignity and those you love? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments because your voice matters and your story might be the light someone else needs. And before we end, let me say this. If you find this story meaningful and want to help us share these important values, please subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next inspiring story. Together, we can build a strong community full of potential and a spirit of justice.